Hi, my name is Jenny Lauren Dowden for Conduit News. Today, we are thrilled to have one of the leading experts on education policy, Jay Greene, joining us in the studio. He is a senior research fellow at the Heritage Institute. And previously, I think many people will know, you were at the University of Arkansas. And not only were you there at the university, but you started and founded the education policy department there.
Yeah, I was a distinguished professor and chair of the Department of Education Reform for 16 years.
That's incredible. Yeah. We really appreciate all of the work that department has done.
Yep.
One other thing that I noticed on your resume that I'm not going to hold against you, I hope that our viewers won't, is I saw University of Texas on there. You taught there for a few years.
I was a professor at the University of Texas and at the University of Houston.
Yeah.
And then I've also spent time in think tanks. I was a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute in New York, and now I'm a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. So I've had experience both in think tanks and in universities. I live here in Arkansas. I work remotely for the Heritage Foundation.
Tell us a little bit, before we move on, I want to talk to you about some things that the Heritage Foundation has recently published. Tell us just about your background, the work that you've done, specifically at the Manhattan Institute and now at Heritage.
Sure. So I have a PhD in political science from Harvard, and I started studying education policy kind of soon after graduating. I actually didn't study it as a graduate student. I studied legislative executive relations. So, schools are basically political organizations in that they are agencies of the government, for the most part. Public schools are, and then there are policies that govern all schools, including private schools, and those policies are part of politics. And so I've studied political science and then applied that in the area of education policy. When I worked at the Manhattan Institute, I did a lot of work related to school choice. Actually, it was when I was at the University of Houston that, along with my mentor, Paul Peterson at Harvard, we did the first randomized experiment on the effects of private school choice in Milwaukee. So we did the Milwaukee voucher study, where we found that there were learning gains for students who were able to choose a private school. This was back in 1996. Wow. And it led to a host of other private school choice programs being adopted in other states. And then also I was studying charter schools, which began in the United States around 1990 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And so the school choice movement is, barely older than my involvement in it. So I've been in it more or less from the founding.
Yeah, well, before we talk about it, because I want to talk to you about this state report card first, but how have you seen the landscape change during your time studying it?
So, well, first, when we started looking into school choice and doing research on it, and doing advocacy for it, it seemed like a crazy tiny movement. I mean, we were a very small number of people. There was only one modern publicly financed private school choice program in the United States, which was in Milwaukee, started in 1990 also. We were just trying to see if we could get anyone to agree that it was reasonable that parents might want to control the education of their own children. Now, I have to say that it was widely held opinion at the time that parents should not control the education of their own children, that there were people who were trained experts at this, and that we should defer to those trained experts. And so it was thought to be radical to have parents direct the education of their own children. Well, in the last 30 years, 25 years, this is totally flipped.
Yeah.
It is now widespread for people to believe that parents should have at least some say in the education of their own children, have some control over where and how they're educated. And we now have 40 some states with charter schools, when at the time we had one. We now have a majority of states with private school choice programs, when at the time we had one. And so this is a huge expansion in school choice and a really remarkable transformation in the public mindset about this. Also, politicians now widely embrace the idea of parental control in education in both parties. Very occasionally, you'll have instances where, like, Governor McAuliffe will slip and say out loud what he might be privately thinking, that parents should have no say, and when they do that, they suffer badly at the polls. And so that to me feels like the progress of the effort that I've been involved in for the last quarter century. That we've managed to change the popular and political discussion about school choice in a very dramatic way. Now, that being said, we still have a very, very long way to go.
Yes, we do.
I mean, so we now only have a couple 100,000 kids in private school choice programs with public support. That's out of more than 50 million kids in K-12 education. And we also, have only a couple million kids in charter school choice, again, out of more than 50 million. And so the vast, vast majority of children remain in locally assigned public schools.
Well, let's talk about the state report card, or the education report card that the Heritage Foundation published. It's called the Education Freedom Report Card. And so it ranks the states based on education freedom in that particular state. And there are a variety of factors. Talk to us about those factors that were considered and just your overall impression of the report card. And then, if you would, just briefly talk about Arkansas and where we rank.
Sure. So there were 4 components to the Education Freedom Report Card. There's school choice, there's transparency, there's regulatory freedom, and then return on investment or spending. And so these are different aspects of what it means to empower parents to control the education of their own children, which is our understanding of education freedom. And on all of these dimensions, Arkansas is okay. Right? It's not the worst, but it's also not the best on any of these dimensions. And so the overall result for Arkansas is fine. Now, you also have to kind of grade this a bit on a curve, because there are a lot of other states that are even less fine. And so Arkansas comes out overall 13th on the ranking, and never actually falls below 20th, even on any of the 4 subcomponents. But now, we can go through briefly why. For example, Arkansas has private school choice. It has a bill, but it's not a very good bill. And only a few hundred kids participate in it. So it has something, so it gets points for that, but it doesn't have something that's very good. Okay. It has charter school choice, but we don't have the breadth and strength of charter schools that we should have. So it has it, but it's fine. Arkansas does do well at homeschooling, is supportive of homeschoolers, and also is helped by the fact that it has numerous small school districts, which is an important dimension of school choice, because people can move to access desired school districts, which may have different policies from each other. And that's an important part of school choice too. On the other aspects, Arkansas does particularly well on transparency and regulatory freedom, to the extent that it does have a law that restricts CRT training for teachers and other public employees. But it's a weak law, but it has a law. And also, Arkansas does have a very high rate of alternatively certified teachers, which also is part of education freedom, because it means that we are able to hire from a larger labor pool and find the very best and properly motivated people, and not simply those with a credential. So those are all good things. And then lastly, on spending, Arkansas spends a medium amount, and it has kind of a mediocre amount of achievement. And so the return on investment in Arkansas is mediocre. So it's a big kind of mediocre state.
What I hear you say is, no one go patting yourselves on the back.
Right. But I mean, you shouldn't hang your head in shame, but there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think that's, so we could talk about how could Arkansas be better? Because the real purpose of this report card is to give a roadmap to policymakers for how to do better, how to improve.
And I want to hear that. But before you go on to that, you were talking about grading on a scale. So what does that look like? Are these weighted scores? Tell us the scoring, and then how Arkansas landed where they are. Not as high as they did, but considering.
Right. So on every one of the 4 subcomponents of the Education Improvement Report Card, there are components beneath them. And on every one of those, every state is essentially ranked relative to all other states. And then this is a combination of all those things.
Okay.
So we're always grading on a curve, not relative to an absolute scale.
Yeah.
So on an absolute scale, I'd say Arkansas would be more disappointing. But on a relative scale, Arkansas is doing okay.
Talk to us about Florida and Arizona that received the highest ranking on the card. What are they doing really well that could be modeled?
Right. So Arizona has a universal ESA, an education savings account. This we think is the best model for school choice. What it does is it takes something like 90% of what is spent on the child in a traditional public school, and it puts it into a savings account. And that savings account is available to the family to purchase educational services as they see fit. It can go towards tuition at a private school, and or it can go to paying for supplemental services of various kinds. So therapies that they think are beneficial for their child, tutors, educational equipment like computers. Basically, it allows the family to build an educational package for their own child that is the kind of thing that they think their child most needs, and it puts the parent in charge with the resources that the public devotes for the education of that child.
So talk to us then about Arkansas. What can Arkansas do to rank higher, to improve education freedom for parents and kids?
Well, I mean, the best thing that we could do in Arkansas is adopt a universal ESA. Unfortunately, I don't think it's around the corner.
Okay. Tell us why, because I hear people say, if it were ever to happen, now is a time to push for it.
Yes, now is a great time for pushing this forward. And I think there is this post-pandemic moment where families got to see the quality and content of the education their children were receiving in traditional public schooling, and quite often they were disappointed with what they saw, and that anger on the part of parents is being channeled into passing a significant number of new private school choice programs. Unfortunately, I think Arkansas is not on the cusp. And the reason for that, I think, is 2 things. One, Arkansas is a heavily rural state, and school choice has a little bit more work to do to convince rural constituencies about how they benefit. Now, they do benefit, and we can talk about that, but it's a harder sell to rural legislators, because they hear from their local superintendent, who often is the largest employer in town, that this is a horrible idea and is going to hurt the local industry, and that scares away a lot of rural legislators. I think what we need to do is to remind those rural legislators that they also have families in their communities who are noticing that there's a growing disconnect between the values that those families hold dear and what's being taught in their schools. And families have seen this in much more stark terms, in part because of Zoom education and pandemic, but also because they've seen schools have drifted further away from them over time as they've received federal regulations and state regulations, pushing them away from the values that those communities hold dear. And so those families have to be organized and able to communicate with their legislators. And ultimately, legislators have to fear basically losing the votes of those families, being primaried by people supported by those families if they vote no on school choice, just as they currently fear being primaried or losing votes from the superintendent. And essentially, they have to make a cost-benefit calculation that actually it's better for them to get on board for school choice than to oppose it. This is happening in other states. Texas, Oklahoma are getting very close, and they're on the cusp. Arkansas, we haven't organized those rural communities in the same way yet.
So that would be the first thing that we really need to do. But you think the ESA, that the Universal Education Plan, is going to be a hard sell? Well, come this January specifically.
Who knows? We might, we might be able to get it through this term. But I think that's going to be hard. I think the second thing that's hurt us is that we've had a very bad strategy for promoting school choice, where we're not arguing for universal. Advocates have continually proposed very modest and highly limited bills, which is why that's what we get, in the belief that somehow appeals more if you make it more limited. But all that does is actually limit who can benefit from it, and therefore who could be mobilized in support of it.
Right. It seems as though in many instances, our legislators just kind of dance around the edges of things rather than just such as school choice, going all in and knowing that this is something now that parents really want for their kids. And you mentioned this earlier. It was kind of that pandemic phase when the kids were on Zoom and mom was in the kitchen and she's kind of listening, but not really. And then all of a sudden something, she hears, perks up her ears. And I think now we are seeing so many different agendas come through the schools. And as you mentioned before, Arkansas, they passed a bill that says no CRT in schools, or, you can't have your teachers train in it. But a lot of people here in Arkansas would say, there's a lot going on that we really need to stop. What does that look like? What should parents do? What should legislators consider?
Right. So, look, I think the other major issue making its way throughout America is what's called gender ideology. And gender ideology is this movement that there are people born as boys or girls who can change their sex, and that schools need to be affirming in their approach to this. Now, it's a very complicated issue. And I think that what we could say is that what's really important is that all of the adults in a child's life be on the same page and working together to help children. And one of the sad things that's happened with this gender ideology movement is that it has separated the adults and pitted them against each other. So you have kids showing up at school who say, I would like to change my name, I would like to change my pronoun, and the school then facilitates this change and often does so in secret from parents, which is dividing the adults. And I think this is a very dangerous thing. And the reason why it's dangerous is that it's clear that there's what's called comorbidity. That is, there's an overlap between kids who come to school and seek to have their names changed and their pronouns changed, and high rates of depression, anxiety, and other psychological issues. And the profile of this looks a lot like the previous waves of eating disorders and cutting among teenage girls. It has a very similar profile. This is a movement overwhelmingly occurring among adolescent girls. And just as with eating disorders and cutting, girls would show up at school and they would essentially be presenting a physical manifestation of an internal distress. And in the past, when girls would show up at school with evidence of eating disorders or cutting, the adults in the school would recognize this as a problem, and they would coordinate with the parents and try to come up with plans for addressing whatever underlying psychological issues were there. Now what's happening is that the people in the school believe they have to, or that it's best practice to, when a girl shows up at school and says, I'd like to be called by a boy's name and boys' pronouns, the school says, good for you.
Yeah.
Right. They would never say to a girl who showed up with cutting or eating disorder, good for you for being your true self. But they do say this when girls are showing up with new names and pronouns. Good for you for being so brave to be your true self. Let's not talk about it with your parents, and let's work out a gender transition plan here in school. And that by the time the parents really catch wind of all this and understand what's going on, it's a fait accompli.
Yeah.
And the kid's pretty far committed to this path. And then parents are essentially emotionally extorted with the claim that if they don't get on board, that their kid will kill him or herself. And again, this kind of suicide blackmail is not normally catered to.
Yeah.
But in this case, it is, and it's distorting the decisions of a lot of adults.
Talk to us. You also wrote an article about this. You talked about lowering the age of students, kids being allowed to go through this. We are seeing it's making headlines right now.
Right.
Vanderbilt, several organizations are completely removing the age. At any age. Arkansas Children's Hospital has a gender program. UAMS has a gender program. We don't know how far they go with that. What can parents do? Okay, so let's say, man, you know what? I don't want this in our schools. This is tragic. We got to protect the kids.
Right.
Okay, well, you have all these emotions about it. They're angry, frustrated. But what's something positive that they can do to affect change across the schools and for the kids?
Really, I think this is something policymakers can do.
Okay.
And there's a proposal out there that was developed by Max Eden at the American Enterprise Institute called the Given Name Act.
Okay.
And his idea is that school staff should not be able to call a child by a name or a pronoun other than what's in a birth certificate without written permission of parents. Now, this doesn't mean that this applies only to students who identify as transgender. It would apply to any change in name. So if a child is wants to go by Junior or Timmy instead of Timothy, that's fine. Parents just, when they sign kids up for school in kindergarten, fill out a form and they say, here are some nicknames that are okay for my child. And then if this changes as the child grows older, they can amend that form at any time and say what they think it's okay for the child to be called. The important point here is that children don't get to decide what they're called by representatives of the government, right? The teachers and the staff. Just as when you show up at the DMV, you can't say, I know it says this name on my birth certificate, but I want my driver's license to say something else. Children don't get to decide this. Adults bring children into the world as parents, and they think long and hard about what the names of their children should be. And that process deserves deference. Those parents deserve deference. And so the child should be called by teachers and staff the names that the parents think the child should be called. Friends can call each other whatever they want, but people who work for the government shouldn't be calling children names other than what the parents think the child should be called. But the good thing about this is that it forces all of the adults in the child's life to talk to each other early on. So, the first thing a child does when they start on some sort of path of gender transition is to say they would like to be called by a different name and pronoun. This forces the adults in the school and the parents to talk to each other and work out a plan together. And I don't know what the resolution of that plan should be. But I know that it's essential for the well-being of children that all of the adults in their lives be on the same page, and that the parents have primacy,
right,
in determining how their children are raised.
Yeah, I would think so too. We've seen emails from staff through FOIAs where they've said, we have a student just came to us and she wants to be called this now. Her family, her parents aren't supportive yet. So when you talk to her family, just call her by her birth name. That blows my mind. That blows my mind that there's such a disconnect between the school and the parents. And like you said, it's time to bring them together.
Right. Parents shouldn't have to co-parent with the state.
Right.
So the state doesn't get to decide that the parents are not sufficiently on board or progressive and override parents' concerns about what they would wish their children to be called.
Something that you said earlier when we were talking, you said, it's not necessarily that schools are driving this or that they're the cause of this, but they are certainly facilitating it. Talk to us about that.
Well, so the most common path by which children get interested in this is by peer influence, often online. So, I mean, one thing we might say to parents is be very careful about your child's online activity. Make sure that you're monitoring it, make sure that you're involved in your child's life enough so that you talk about what's going on in their online life as well, because you don't want your child to get caught up with a group online that begins to offer solutions to the internal distress that kids have. Look, it's hard growing up, and it's really hard. Teenage girls are having a particularly rough time, and they're looking for solutions to their problems. And there are people out there who will offer them bad solutions or solutions that turn out to be counterproductive. And the best person for helping steer a child in growing up is the parent. And so the parents have to be there to help with that process by making sure that the child isn't recruited online, typically by other girls being recruited by other girls online. It's a peer-to-peer influence. Again, following a very similar pattern to eating disorders and cutting, most of which were girls recruiting other girls into what they believed was a solution to internal distress.
Going back to the given name legislation, you'll remember in 2021, Representative Mary Bentley proposed something similar, right? Where it would not allow students to go by a different pronoun or whatever, but it made it out of the House, died in the Senate, as do most some even halfway decent education bills do. But you mentioned that these two are very different. The given name bill and then what Representative Bentley did. Talk to us about the distinction between those two.
Sure. So the bill that failed in the last session in Arkansas was about what teachers had to do. Okay. So it said that teachers didn't have to use a name or pronoun that they didn't want to use, that they couldn't be compelled to use a name or pronoun that they objected to. But I think that didn't focus on the right actor that we're trying to protect here. We're trying to protect parents, not teachers. And so the issue is, what do the parents want? And I think if we frame it around that, it's extremely hard for people to oppose. This is a very simple, common sense bill, in that it places the parents first. And it's very hard for anyone to object to the idea that parents don't deserve deference with respect to the names that their own children are called. And it also doesn't say that this applies only in the issue of children who identify as transgender. It applies if children wish to be called anything. It just establishes the principle they don't get to decide. The school doesn't get to decide. The parents get to decide. And so I think that provides legal protection as well against court challenges. It also helps schools solve a problem that they're beginning to face. So they're discovering that as they adopt policies that say that children will be called names and pronouns that they select, whatever they may be, mischievous children are beginning to come up with hilarious names and pronouns.
Right.
There are instances of children wishing to have pronouns of rock and banana, or you want to name your child, or they wish to call themselves monster or something like that. And this is disruptive to school order and undermines school discipline. And schools are noticing that if they turn over the power of names and pronouns to children, that they're turning a lot of power over to children for how the school is run in general. And this is a bad idea. Again, adults should be in charge here, not children.
These are things that you never thought you'd have to say, right?
Right. So I think this kind of Given Name Act could really help schools in figuring out how to manage a potentially disruptive situation of children mischievously wishing to call themselves strange names or strange pronouns.
Something else that parents are dealing with in the schools. So it's, of course, critical race theory. We're seeing the gender identity heavily pushed. We're also seeing this DEI program really just entrenched throughout professional development, curriculum, choices of books that the kids have to read. It's just, it's so entrenched in these schools, particularly there, one school district here in Arkansas. How do we get ahead of that? And can we? And what would you suggest to policymakers in dealing with these DEI programs?
Sure. So, like with gender ideology, the vast majority of Americans have intuitions on these issues that are pretty sensible. That is, on gender, the vast majority of parents and adults in general are suspicious of the idea that we should be putting children on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, or subjecting them to surgeries as minors, right? This is something that feels strange to adults, and so it takes coercion to overcome this. And the coercion comes in two forms for gender ideology. One is you have regulations coming down from the Biden administration ordering schools to do this, or else they're violating civil rights legislation. That's their interpretation of civil rights legislation. Disputed interpretation, mind you, but that's their interpretation. But schools are compliant and they go along and they think this is best practice. So that's coercion. And then the other coercion is the suicide threat, which is false, as it turns out. The research I've done actually suggests that making puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones more widely and readily available actually exacerbates suicide risk rather than being protective. And we don't. The most rigorous kind of evidence that we should have on this, which would be a randomized controlled trial of whether these drugs are protective against suicide or not, has never been done, right? So we don't have rigorous evidence, but the best evidence that I'm able to produce suggests that these are actually dangerous for suicide, youth suicide. And so without coercion from regulatory coercion or the suicide threat coercion, the gender ideology goes away because adults are highly suspicious of this. The same is true for DEI. Okay, most Americans have natural political instincts that it's wrong to treat people differently by race, it's wrong to discriminate, and it's also wrong to segregate. I'm not saying this was always true in the United States. It clearly wasn't always true, but it is now a broad consensus within the American population that they think it's not a good idea to treat people differently by race, and not a good idea to segregate people by race. But how do you overcome that? How do you get people to do this thing that they're not naturally inclined to do? Well, coercion. And there's an organizational advantage that allows this coercion to occur, and that's the DEI bureaucracy. DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Those sound like good words, right? Diversity and inclusion clearly are good words. Equity is close to a good word, equality, which is a good word. But the bureaucracies really have to be understood as political commissariat, where their job is to articulate and enforce their ideological orthodoxy on an organization whose natural instincts are that you shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Okay. So part of the DEI ideology is to treat people differently by race and is to segregate, right? Which most people don't want to do.
No.
So it requires this DEI bureaucracy to move this agenda forward within organizations. We've seen this for a long time now in universities, where DEI bureaucracies have grown to be very large and very powerful. In a study that we did, we found that the average university in the United States actually has 45 DEI staff. To put that in perspective, it's like 1 for every 30 tenured or tenure track faculty members, right? So this is a fairly big bureaucracy. And you also keep in mind, these are not faculty engaged in teaching or research. These are support staff. And so they're there again for this political purpose, this political activism, and they advance their agenda by helping amplify their perspective and others on campus who share their perspective, organizing those voices, making them more powerful. And university administrators are not particularly brave or highly principled people. And so they're very ambitious in their careers and they don't wish there to be any trouble. So essentially there are threats from the DEI staff and the groups they help mobilize and amplify that there'll be trouble that might jeopardize careers for senior administrators if their desires are not catered to. And one of the desires they have is to grow the size of their bureaucracy.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And that's part of how we've gotten this very large and powerful DEI infrastructure in higher education, which has significantly distorted the intellectual activity on campus, altered the nature of teaching and research in ways that hinder academic freedom and that are contrary to the true purpose of universities as truth-seeking institutions. So that same kind of coercive bureaucracy that is well entrenched now in higher education is making its way into K-12.
Yeah.
And in K-12, these people are sometimes called chief diversity officers, but they go by different titles. There'll be an associate superintendent for minority achievement, or it'll have different names, but these people are similarly operating as DEI staff within K-12 school systems. And they're doing the same activity, which is that they are helping articulate and enforce an ideological orthodoxy, in part by amplifying and organizing the minority of voices that agree with them against the kind of overwhelming hesitancy to treat people differently by race and to segregate. And in both cases, in both K-12 and higher education, the state legislature can do something about this.
Tell us what.
Right, I mean, so.
Because it feels like it is just this gigantic beast, and it has its tentacles in all parts of all of our institutions. And, you mentioned our public school system. One school district they call them equity champions.
Right.
They're diversity police in every single school building. We know, and we hear this across the nation, teachers are, the coercion, but because of that, they're scared to say anything. Right. They don't go along, they say something about it. Well, there will be consequences, as you mentioned. And so it just almost seems like, okay, what can we do? Tell us what we can do.
Right. And let me be clear. I mean, if they were actually policing for diversity, that is, if they really were promoting that there were people from different backgrounds and with different perspectives who should be accepted and treated properly, and if they really were promoting inclusion, there'd be no problem with this. But that's not really what they are.
That's not what's happening.
Right. So they have taken good words and hijacked them for what is essentially promoting treating people differently by race, which is discrimination, and segregating, right? This is because it's deeply unpopular. This is a totally winnable fight. So don't feel that you're in despair that this is so far gone that there's nothing.
Even though there's a ton of money being pumped into it.
Again, the Soviet Union, it took a lot of money and coercion to keep it propped up for a very long period of time. And people went around and spouted whatever nonsense about the greatness of the Soviet Union up until its dying day. But at some point, no one believes it. And if you talk to people on campus and in school systems, it's amazing the number of people who will tell you, secretly, I agree with you, right? Secretly, let me just say this is all nonsense. But what choice do I have, right? So there's a lack of bravery, but in part that lack of bravery is caused by legitimate fear and coercion. So the legislature can help.
Okay.
Reduce the organizational edge of this tiny group of voices and allow all these people who are too afraid to speak up to feel more empowered so that they can undo this.
Okay.
And the way they can do that is basically just by dismantling DEI bureaucracies. At public universities, those are state agencies, okay? The people who work there are state employees. It would be inappropriate for the state legislature to alter the content of teaching or research at universities because that would be infringing on academic freedom. But DEI bureaucracies are not engaged in teaching or research. They are not faculty, they're support staff, okay? There are separate academic units like gender and ethnic studies units where they are engaged in teaching and research. And this would not interfere with that, but the legislature can say that because it provides support from taxpayers to public universities, and because these are publicly chartered universities, they're owned by the state, they can reorganize bureaucratically those institutions to improve efficiency and to ensure that they're seeking their proper mission. And having a ideology unit, a political commissariat, is both inefficient with taxpayer dollars and is contrary to the true public purpose of these public institutions. And so the legislature can, if it wished to, abolish them, direct the university to eliminate those units, maybe condition public appropriation on that activity. If that were too far, they could, at the very least, they could cap the size of these units at a certain ratio of a certain number of DEI staff for every tenured or tenure-track faculty, so that these units grow ever larger and more politically powerful, which is a big part of their demands, right? Is to grow bigger, because that also is a patronage benefit for all of the activists, students. They can later get employed as DEI staff, right?
Right.
So if you want to put a limit on this vicious cycle of political activity on campus, you can either cap or eliminate these DEI bureaucracies. You could do the same in K-12.
Okay.
Now that'll be a little bit trickier because, again, they haven't fully built out this infrastructure in the way that they have in higher ed, but there are certain positions that you might be able to identify and direct school districts not to have those kinds of positions because you think they're contrary to the true public purpose of school systems. Now the supposed public purpose of chief diversity officers in K-12 is to close achievement gaps. That's what they say they're there for. They have correctly observed that there are very large and persistent gaps between white and black students, rich and poor students, and they wish to close those gaps. And I understand that goal. That's a laudable goal. Ideally, if what we're trying to do is raise everyone as opposed to bring down one group, because there are two ways you can close gaps, right? You could close it by bringing up, or you could close by bringing down, and that would be bad if we did it by bringing people down. But there's no rigorous evidence at all that having chief diversity officers actually helps close gaps. And the exploratory analysis that I've done on this, simply looking at a simple correlation as to if districts have chief diversity officers, do they have closing achievement gaps or not? They actually don't. They have widening achievement gaps. Now, I don't know that that's being caused by the chief diversity officers, but I can say that so far, they don't seem to be helping close achievement gaps because we don't see any evidence of the gaps closing where you have those chief diversity officers in school districts.
Which goes completely against their narrative.
Right. Yes. I mean, again, if we're going to make a very large public investment,
right,
and restructure our schools in ways that are kind of against our natural political instincts,
yeah,
we might demand really rigorous evidence about its benefits. But they don't have rigorous evidence at all. In fact, they don't feel the need to produce evidence at all.
right.
Yeah.
So has any other state passed any type of legislation abolishing these DEI?
No, this is new. But there's significant interest in this in a number of states.
Okay.
A number of states have clear evidence of, especially in higher ed, of DEI getting out of control. And fundamentally altering the nature of the public institutions. Now, private universities are a different story, and it's unclear exactly what can be done there. Although private universities receive very large amounts of public subsidy, and so it's possible that changes could be produced there related to the very large public subsidies they receive.
So just give us, if you're looking at the political or the education landscape for the next year, specifically Arkansas, you see this great parent movement happening. There's more accountability and hopefully transparency within the schools. What do you think it looks like a year from now here in Arkansas, and then just across the country as far as school choice?
Right. So I mean, this last year was a year of school choice. We saw an enormous expansion in private school choice programs around the country. And I think we're going to see another strong year around the country. I think it's possible that Arkansas will be included among them, but I think that's not the most likely thing. I think the more likely thing is that we could see these values issues become more salient.
Yeah.
And as they become more salient, the case for school choice grows stronger because when we notice that our schools are working at odds to the values preferred by the communities they serve and the parents they serve, our first inclination is to come up with laws that will directly address that disconnect by forbidding schools from doing certain things. And we're discovering how hard it is really to
do that.
Order schools not to teach certain things or to do certain things, that especially when they don't want to do that. And so the real power to control how schools teach and what they teach is to empower parents to choose alternatives if they wish. And that will actually make the other laws more enforceable, because now there's something that really matters here, which is you can lose students and funding that's attached to them. So, and I have to say that the values argument for school choice has proven far more effective than the achievement argument. Now, both are true. I believe that expanding school choice and empowering parents improves achievement, but that's actually not the primary concern of most families. Most families are just trying to raise their children to be decent human beings who have values that are roughly consistent with their own. And yes, they want them to have achievement skills that lead to employment, but that's not the only thing that parents care about. It might be the only thing their employers care about, but the only thing the main thing that parents care about is that their children grow up to be decent people. And they're trying to, so we should think of education as an extension of child rearing, part of how we raise children to be decent adults. Now, decent adults also have to provide for themselves and be employable, but they don't have to maximize their income. They just have to be good people. And we need to make the case that to parents that the best way they can raise their children is if they control the education of their children and the values that go with that. And I think that pitch is working extremely well. But saying, think of your school like you think of choice and competition among grocery stores doesn't work very well for parents, because parents don't think of the school as as a market competition. They think of their school as an extension of their family, as they should.
Yeah.
Right? It is an extension of their family. And so if we emphasize that and emphasize how the school is a helper to the family in raising children with values that the families prefer, then I think we can get everyone on board for expanding school choice with this values orientation as opposed to a narrow focus on achievement.
Incredible insight. I feel like we could probably ask you questions all day long, and we
Well, I'll just have to come back.
Yeah. Love for you too. Yeah, there's so much that we still want to cover with you. We're so thankful that you came to the studio. Is there anything else that I know that we haven't covered, but that you would want to add or make sure that as a takeaway?
I think we've covered things really well. It's been fun talking to you.
It's fun talking to you. We can't wait to have you back on.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.